Hey, thanks for checking out Nuts and Bolts with Tone, and welcome to my channel. Today we have a 2014 2.1 4-cylinder Sprinter. When you turn the key, it just clicks one time. One time click and that's it. Alright, so this one has a bad starter, and I'm going to show you how to replace this. It's a little bit weird, it's a little bit tricky because of how it comes out, and you can't really see it. So I'm going to show you how to replace that. Before we do that, hit that like button, hit the bell, and you get notified of all my future content, and also hit the subscribe button. Let's go check out how to do this starter. All right, here we go. We got a 4-cylinder Sprinter, and the starter just clicks when you turn the key. From underneath, you could barely see the starter. It's between the turbo and the engine, and most of the time starters come out the bottom. But this one, the starter is going to come out the top. All right, I'm going to show you how to do that. It's kind of tricky. All right, let's get into it. All right, so step one in removing this starter is to remove this intake air pipe right here. All right, you got a clamp there. You got a disconnect here, and they tell you to remove this, but I'm gonna leave it because disconnecting all this, I have to take all this cover off, and I don't want to do that. So I'm gonna leave that. But technically, you're supposed to take this intake piping out. All right, so first step is going to be to remove this bracket here for the wastegate actuator. So we're going to disconnect this vacuum line back here. Let me see if I can get a better shot of it. All right, so we're going to disconnect this vacuum line back here. All right, and we're going to take this one bolt out right there on top, and then those two bolts on the side. We're going to take those out, and we should be able to take that bracket off and then slide that actuator over and leave it connected, because then we don't have to adjust it. So that's what we're going to try to do, and then we're going to get in there and do the heat shield for the starter. All right, let's see if we can do this without taking the intake piping off. All right, so step one actually is to disconnect the ground here, and all you do is push this red tab down and pull this straight off, and that disconnects the battery from the engine. So now there's no ground, and so we're going to be okay to disconnect the starter. All right, here we go. Step one is going to be to take this intake tube off. There's going to be 3 zip ties, one here, and one there. Go ahead and cut those off. That holds the harness up along this intake tube. I disconnected the airflow meter just to make sure I don't break anything. It's a 7mm here, and it's a 7mm right there. All right, then you're going to have this breather right here. Just take the bolts out and just make sure you lube that O-ring when you put it back together. And those are going to be, let's see, what size are those? Let's see. A T25. All right, and so for this job, it's going to be really beneficial if you have a really short, stubby set of Torx. All right, because there's not a lot of room right there, but also for taking off a bracket down there, we're going to need these little stubbies. So these are Mayhew tools. Carbine Tools also makes them. That's the only thing I have that's not Carbine Tools. Everything else is Carbine Tools. So once we get these disconnected, we're going to go ahead and break that lower one loose and pop this intake tube off. All right, let me get this off, and I'll show you what we're going to do next. All right, so the next step is we need to undo this bracket here for the wastegate solenoid. We're going to disconnect the vacuum line here. We're going to take these 2 bolts out on this side and this one on this side. Now, to get those 2 backside broke loose, they broke loose pretty easy for me. I used a T40 in this Mayhew tool set, and I used my long Capri box wrench, and it's an 11mm for this specific socket, and it broke loose right away. So we're going to get that out of the way, and let me do that. Okay, so I got these 2 bolts out here, and you can see it's loose. All right, Now the reason that we're unbolting this bracket like this, we don't want to touch this wastegate rod because then we have to adjust it. So now we're going to take this off right here. And we should be able to just slide this over out of the way to gain access to the heat shield. All right, so there's that. Now let's see how this is going to work here. All right, so we're gonna need to unbolt the bracket, and that is gonna be 2 nuts. There's one right there, and then there's one right below here to get this out, to have room to move this, to get this bracket out of the way, because the bracket is what we're after, not the wastegate solenoid, because once the bracket's out of the way, the solenoid should move over. The actuator should slide over and get out of our way, because there's the starter heat shield right there. All right, let me get that off and show you what it looks like. Okay, so that plan did not work. I unbolted the bracket and it does not move this over enough. So what we have to do is we do have to disconnect this rod. So what you want to do is you have a little piece that sits on top like this. You just pry it up and it sits over the rod actuator connection right there. All right, so you want to mark this front nut. All right. And then I put a mark on top showing that this needs to be on top aligned with this. And I also put a mark over here showing where the rod is, where it's straight up and down. Now I'm gonna loosen this back nut here, right there. And we're gonna take that nut off and this will pull out. And then obviously we'll put all this back together because, well, it didn't help that I took it all off. So we're gonna get this out of the way and get this heat shield off. All right. So when you loosen the nut, what you got to do is you got to hold the 10mm on this side and then crack this one loose and unthread this, and this just slips inside the shaft. It just comes right out. It doesn't unthread. And get this out of the way. All right, and now let me show you what we're going to do for that heat shield. All right, so here's a blown up version of what we're looking at here. This is what the heat shield looks like. Okay, so we've got looks like 4 bolts there, 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 and there. Let me get this off and then I'll show you what it looks like on the actual heat shield. All right, so all my mounting stuff is broken. So this is the heat shield right here. This is the bracket that sits in the car. It's broken away from the engine. Normally that would be sitting there like this. And then this shield sits like this. Okay, so you have one Torx there, it's an E10, and then you have an E-Torx here and an E-Torx here. I'll show you. All my mounting is broken. So there's one right there, the one on the left, and then you can see that one right there that's right above my light. So normally you would take those out to get this heat shield out. So now that the heat shield's out, the other thing they want you to do is loosen up the dipstick, but obviously I don't need to, and it's broken. Everything's broken on this thing. Not a good way to start with these. So anyways, so what we're gonna do is now we gotta disconnect the starter. So we're gonna disconnect the starter solenoid right there. It's gonna be a 10. And we're gonna disconnect the B positive wire right there. And then we're gonna get this starter out of here. All right. Okay, so working on sprinters can be kind of weird because people add all kinds of alternative power to sprinters. So just to be certain, that we don't have any power before you go and hurt yourself, we're gonna look at this B positive wire right here, and we're gonna touch it with the test light, and it did not light. We're connected to ground. So if by some chance somebody had run some sort of alternative power to this thing, we know that we don't have power and we're safe to remove this. Ground and power would light this light. Now if this light lights, then you need to figure out what's connected. So let me get these off. Right, easier to show you here from this picture, but here is the transmission dipstick. All right, you got a bolt going through the bracket for the transmission dipstick, and then you have a bolt right here. Now there's two bolts side by side. It's the top one there. So the two starter bolts, they should be in a row. There shouldn't be any bolts in between. All right, let me get these off, show you what the bolts look like. All right, so what I used here was I used this E14 in this Carbine Tools Master Tool Torx and Hex set with a wobble and a long transmission extension. So there's the E14. You're gonna need a friend, or you just break it loose and zap the bolts, but to get it started, you're gonna need a friend to get in there and get it started, because you gotta be way back to get around the brackets, because the lower bolt is inside of a bracket for the exhaust, for the cat, and the top one goes through the transmission dipstick. So it's gonna be real difficult to start those bolts by yourself. So now I got the starter out, and let me get the new one and get it ready to go in. Okay, so looking at this right here, you want to make sure that when you put your eyelet on here, that it goes between these two pieces here. If you don't have it turned right, it'll be up on here and it won't tighten down all the way. You want to make sure it's between here. It also orients the wire in the correct location so it doesn't hit anything. All right, and it's a 10 millimeter for that and a 13 for the B positive. Let me get these tightened up. Okay, so now that we've got that all connected, you don't want to put all this back together and have a problem and have to take it back apart. So all we're going to do is make sure that it cranks, and we're going to turn it right back off, and then we're going to put everything back together. So we're going to come over here. Going to get the key. Going to come in here, connect the ground, and then we're going to, okay, and it started up. Mine just clicked before, so now I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this ground back so I can get the heat shield bolts off. And I'm replacing the heat shield, but now I'm going to put everything back together. So Mercedes had this heat shield in stock, so obviously it's a common problem for this to happen. So now I'm going to go and get my E10s out of the block. And here's your old starter here. Make sure you use a good quality starter. And one more tip about this intake air pipe is this bottom connection here was real difficult to get loose. So spray some WD-40 or something down there, and then use like a hose pick tool and just kind of pick at it like this, and it'll pull away and eventually twist and pop off. And then make sure you zip tie your harness back to this intake air tube so your harness doesn't get pinched. And the last thing is, make sure that this nut is in the exact position that it was. So for me, it is right there. And remember, I marked the rod so I know exactly where the top is. So that nut needs to line up right there, just like that. I'm going to slide it through, tighten this back nut, and I'll be good to go. Don't forget to tighten down your vacuum line here. That is how you replace a starter in a 4-cylinder Sprinter. Okay, so now that I showed you how to do this starter, it should be a piece of cake. Showed you the easiest way to get in there, how to get it out, and also about that heat shield. Don't forget that heat shield has a problem. And I'm sure it's a common problem, so you may as well find this on yours as well. So thanks for watching the video. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell. You get notified of all my future content, which you're definitely going to want to see. Also check me out on Instagram at Nuts and Bolts with Tone for my daily life as a mechanic. And check me out on Instagram at Nuts and Bolts with Tone for my daily life as a mechanic. Show you all kinds of cool stuff with gas, diesel, show you some tools. And check out my merchandise store. You can get a t-shirt, a coffee cup, and support Nuts and Bolts with Tone. I'll see you guys next time.